Okay, good evening everybody. Welcome to Arts in the Pub. It's a big night tonight. We have three speakers, so we're going to jump straight into it. Our first speaker tonight is Laszlo Szabo. Please join me in welcoming Laszlo.
Right, before I launch into it, I'm going to explain my costume, which helps me get over my nerves. Through my business, I've just supported a filmmaking venture with an emerging filmmaker coming out of VCA, a final year graduate, Anna Batalimbisi, who has just made a film about blackbirding up North Queensland. I was encouraged by not only the pitch that she put to me, but by the fact that the project was very much a community-based thing. She even brought actors over from family and extended family from the Solomon Islands to be in the film to tell a very, very important story, one which I think has many angles to it, and hopefully we'll get more and more of those stories of the cane fields and of the assimilation of Pacific Island people into Australian culture. So that's what this is. It's a promo for her, and she's just sent me the merchandise today, fulfilling her crowdfunding obligations. And I have a few things to give away here. So there's some postcards if you want to send quirky little black and white pictures of people on the cane fields. Two precious Solomon Island flag colours stubby holders, which were handmade by a community, and a couple of key rings. So you'll have to fight for them. I was going to run a lucky door prize, but I didn't have any tickets. Right, my name is Laszlo Szabo. I live in Armidale. I'm a community artist based here. I have been here since the beginning of 1993 and have worked almost exclusively in the field of community arts. I've just been told by the Australia Council what I am. I'm a multidisciplinary artist working in the field of community cultural development. Really, I'm just a gun for hire, and I have been for 20 odd years. I've pretty much worked exclusively in that field. I'm probably the longest lasting community artist in our region. I've worked from Lismore across to Moree, down to Coonabarabran, and across to Port Macquarie. So I've worked in a fairly large footprint over the last 20 odd years. I have a theatre background, and I came to filmmaking quite late in the piece. I returned to film, if you like, with my community work. And to tell you a story that takes you way back, and hopefully what this does is sort of this biography of mine kind of orients you towards what I think the word community means, and then I'll deal with filmmaking separately. I don't call myself a filmmaker. I use the medium in my work, so that kind of helps to orient you where I am. The film industry would have me called a videographer rather than a filmmaker, and I'm happy with that. I don't dispute that. I'm a working class kid, the child of refugee migrants who came to Australia in the late 50s, and I bring that up only because it's kind of pertinent to the situation that we find ourselves in here in this country and also in Europe. My folks fled Hungary pretty much or very close to where that truck that had 70 people die in the back of it just recently. They crossed the border into Austria in late 1956, very close to that point. They didn't know each other. They met in a camp in Austria and then went on to Germany, which is where I was born. And then in the late 50s, 59, they were given passage through the Catholic Church, and I'll talk about the Catholic Church again later, to Australia. They had their choice, Canada or Australia. They had their choice of Melbourne or Sydney. They ended up in Sydney. We got stuck out at Skyville, way out near Windsor, which in those days was the boondocks in the middle of nowhere. And although the fence wasn't all that high, there was barbed wire atop it. And although people could, to some extent, come and go, we were still pretty much incarcerated. It was a camp. The idea was that after 12 months, we would be let out into the community. And most of those people there ended up either primarily on the Snowy scheme, either there or in Port Kembla. The idea was that if you were a married man, they wanted you at that stage to go to Port Kembla to work in the steelworks. And if you were single, you'd go up to the Snowy in the final stages of its construction. They kind of stopped married men going up there because they caused all sorts of trouble. They tried to abandon their wives, which is in fact what my father tried to do. And my mother, heavily pregnant with my sister, with me in tow, hunted him down, and we ended up living in Wollongong, in Fairy Meadow. So that was our start, out of 2 camps, and then assimilated into the boom, the construction of contemporary Australia. And if anyone wonders what contribution migrants make to this country, it's not just the Frank Lowies, the great success stories of the men in business. It's the people who built the dams, the railroads, the people who did the hack work, the work that we're accused of stealing from Australians, but also the work that Australians weren't really prepared to do at the time. Puts me in a kind of polemic situation, doesn't it? Most of my work is about cultural activism in some way or other. It's about empowering people to pick up the media, the arts and communications as a tool in terms of getting their stories out. Biography. Okay, so I grew up in Struggle Street, Mount Druitt. Anyone watched Struggle Street recently? I came from the inner urban ghettos of Sydney after we left Wollongong, after the work dried up. Marrickville, Newtown, all those places that got cleared of the poor, the working poor, to make way for development and for the gentrification of those suburbs. So as you walk along King Street, Newtown, walking into a trendy Thai restaurant, that's where we went op shopping to buy clothes when I was a kid. That's where we went to get our hair cut. That's where we met other migrants. Now, Hungarians don't kind of cluster in great communities. They kind of tend to be isolates mostly, although there are Hungarian communities in both Melbourne and Sydney. Pretty much they kind of kept to themselves. We did. I was isolated pretty much from the world of culture, of arts, of even television. I didn't have television until I was nearly 17. I didn't go to the movies. I think I went to the movies 3 times as a kid. So the whole idea of filmmaking in the media was something I came to much, much later. Mount Druitt was worse than you saw on television in those days, in the early 70s. Although the drugs might not have been quite as hard, it was still a violent, nasty hellhole. And a poor, sensitive child like me who read books, who dreamt of faraway places, had a shit time there. I was bullied, harassed. I was subjected to domestic violence and alcoholism within my own family. We were kept in isolation from the outside world. We were surrounded by English, Irish, Scottish people. We lived in this very tight, small world. It wasn't until I went to university that I kind of came running and drank up everything that I could in terms of experience, film, theatre, music, the whole thing. So I grew up in a cultural desert. The only thing I had was literature, and I was a bookish kid. I had my head in a book continuously. I could walk the house, I could walk the yard, either that or I was outside over the back, and over the back was the creek and the tip. So I spent a lot of my childhood on the tip, on my own. Found some great things, numerous dead dogs, Nazi war helmets, all sorts of stuff there. My interest in the arts sort of came late. It was kind of, I was half-hearted about it, although I did get dragged into the school shows, the school concerts, to pad out the number of boys on stage. And it wasn't until after my parents split up that I could stop telling the lie that I was going to be an electrical engineer or a dentist, and then suddenly I turned towards the theatre. I went to University of New South Wales. I studied theatre and film there. Film, particularly so under the late Peter Gerdes, whose specialty was documentary. I went to the theatre 3 or 4 times a week. I went to every movie I could see, every art film that was recommended to me. I ended up working at the Opera House as a tour guide. I saw every show. I watched rehearsals. You couldn't drag me away from the place. I was there like 10, 12 hours a day, just soaking it all in. I went into the theatre when I left. I actually started as a street performer. I was one of the first wave of street performers in Sydney, setting myself alight outside the George Street cinemas and in King's Cross. And I recently just come across some of my peer group, Thor Bloomfield, who started Legs on the Wall and a few others, and we were the first ones out there in the late 70s, juggling, eating fire, buffoonery. And I worked my way through 2 years of university. I earned more in one night than I could in 5 nights working at Woolworths, which is why I kind of kept it up. The early 80s saw the film boom hit Australia, the 10BA, the infamous 10BA, when everybody rushed in this kind of gold rush mentality towards the film industry. I hung around it for a little while. I did come in from an oblique angle. I hung around with some of the people who were the last of the Sydney Film Co-op, some of those kind of radical political filmmakers of the 60s and the 70s. I hung out with Hugh Keys Burns and the Macau Light Company, who were the kind of mainstays of Peter Brook's visit to Australia for the Mahabharata, and who were also largely cast in Mad Max, the first Mad Max film. I would have been in Mad Max, but I didn't want to dye my hair pink. I just got a new girlfriend and I just got a new job, and I said sorry. But the idea of riding a bike from Sydney to somewhere out in South Australia and not washing for 10 days, which was the direction that George gave us. I want you to hop on a bike. I don't want you to wash. I want you to just turn up as feral and as smelly as you can. I hung around the edges of the film industry. I didn't much like it. At that time, it was a kind of place for cowboys, and it was a kind of hard-drinking, drug-taking, messy kind of sphere. Lots of money was being made, lots of names were made in that period, and I found myself drawn to the theatre instead. I really wanted to, as it were, finish off my education. I ended up going to Melbourne. I was drawn to Melbourne to work with the APG and La Mama. That was a kind of like a pilgrimage. That was the Mecca for me. I got there, I walked into a room, and there were 50 middle-aged people all squabbling, all old lefties, squabbling, not just because they were shutting down those theatres, but because they'd all slept with each other, they'd all fucked each other's lives up over the years, and there was lots of bitterness in that room. So I arrived in Melbourne going, hey, I'm ready to go, you know, the avant-garde, larrikin kind of theatre, shit. So I hadn't touched a film camera since my university days. It wasn't until I arrived here in Armidale, and that was after I'd retrained at TAFE. I consider myself to be one of TAFE's success stories. I retrained in my mid-40s in multimedia, and it was from there that I picked up the camera again. That coincides with the kind of the revolution in technology, of digital technology. In the interim, I ran a theatre company for nearly 10 years in Melbourne, which started in Sydney. I ran this sort of fringe independent theatre company in Melbourne for nearly 10 years. The word independent was very uncommon then. It's used everywhere these days. Indie music, indie filmmaking, indie theatre. It was a pretty rare thing to do. And that was for 10 years, that was my apprenticeship as playwright, director, actor, producer, the whole gamut. I was just hungry to learn everything I could about that medium. I got to the end of it, I had a kind of enormous sense of dissatisfaction. I wasn't happy with what I was doing. I was caught up in the world of showbiz. I realised that I had only ever been inside black boxes, and if you know what the fringe theatre's about, you'll know that black boxes and church halls are the thing. And I was only mixing with actors, and I was only ever seeing the same kind of thing. And it took me a while to realise I'd had enough of it. I actually wanted to be out in the real world. Should I say that? Yeah. Amongst real people. And I began this kind of tentative venture out into community, doing shows for primary school kids, taking shows into prisons, exploring, trying to stretch my wings out of that whole kind of narrow, confined world of weren't you wonderful, darling, you know, how was I tonight, that kind of world. I'd had enough of that. It wasn't until I moved back to Sydney, 91, and then out to Bathurst that I really launched into this kind of community thing. I took on the Tooheys 1000, the big car race, and did the community entertainment for that, and nearly killed myself. We did 15 floats for the parade, a cabaret show, family entertainment in the park with something like 15 different events at the same time. Gave birth to Circus Monoxide, for those of you that have ever come across them. it was hectic, but I kind of thought I've arrived because I'm actually talking to farmers, I'm actually talking to people, the guy who runs the local milk bar. I've got people who can't act, but I can kind of shape them into something. Students from Mitchell Theatre and Media. I kind of felt this was the right place to be. I went to South Africa in '92 and did a kind of professional tour of community theatre and professional theatre. I looked at what was happening there. I'd already been kind of drawn to it in the mid-'80s when a lot of shows started to tour out of South Africa, the protest theatre that came out of South Africa. And I started to think, I like the way these people go about what they're doing. I like what they're saying. I like how they're saying it, that they're not shy of being popular. They're not shy of putting a song and a dance in a show, of telling stories directly to me. I was very much drawn to it. And so that professional kind of observation really cemented in my mind what I wanted to do. When we landed here in Armidale, straight out the door I walked on an autumn festival with the community, and then in a short space of time I was collaborating with the Aboriginal community and UNE Theatre Studies on the production of Munjong that went on in the town hall, and that really kind of kicked things off. I sort of floated a bit. By 2000 I kind of thought, people keep asking me for this kind of digital stuff, this media stuff, this video, it's kind of coming. So I went to TAFE, I took the year off, and one of my teachers here, and thanks to them, I actually found a way that I could survive in the regions. It's very difficult, almost impossible, and certainly impossible since we lost the New England Theatre Company, to actually imagine that you could work professionally in your own sphere. It was Chris Halligan, Councillor Chris Halligan, who was working in community, came up to me one day and said, we got this youth centre that's being run by Young Life out the back of council. You reckon you could come in and do some workshops with the kids? And I thought, oh yeah, I kind of got a vague idea from the work that I'd done at TAFE of what a digital camera might do. And then I started documenting community events. I was invited out to start documenting things like Harmony Day. I went on the road with the Archie Ruby tour. Some of you may remember that. We travelled the region, took a busload of kids, and we were the tag-alongs. We followed Archie and Ruby, Uncle Archie and Ruby around the region, and letting the kids film and document this tour. It's then that I crossed paths with the precursor to Beyond Empathy, when they were the northwestern chapter of Big Heart, and that led to one of the greatest collaborations for me to work with a multimedia artist out in Moree, Maddie Priestley, who was using video and theatre in combination, not quite knowing how that would work. Immediately I could bring my theatre skills to bear on this, and we worked on these kind of multimedia shows, and that's become a kind of trademark for Beyond Empathy, as it has for Big Heart. There's these combinations of performance and video. So I was frantically learning this new form, this thing, picking up these domestic level cameras, these point and shoot things, partly because that gear made it accessible to all of us engaged on these projects, whereas a professional level camera is a kind of daunting thing. You've got too many buttons to push, lenses to change. So we went out on the road with these tiny little mini DV cameras that were shooting in kind of old standard definition formats, a crappy microphone stuck on it and one tripod. And we kind of, over the years, have layered up the kind of complexity. When you look at Lorina's film tonight, you'll see we're kind of way up the top there now. We're using professional gear. We're using larger crews. It's probably the closest to filmmaking of all of my projects. It's got more art in it, and that's partly because it's an elegy, it's a tribute to Lorina's grandmother. But it's also about learning skills. And one of the things that has driven my work all the way through is the need to share skills with people. It's one of the biggest things that we lack in the regions, one of the things that we so seldom have access to. I'll just point out that Metro Screen, who have backed Lorina and I for a number of years, we've been collaborators for 7 or 8 years. Metro Screen is closing. It's been a kind of vital part not only of the Sydney film scene of training and engendering young talent, promoting young talent. It's also been important to us in the regions through their various programs, is no more. So we were kind of lucky in that we managed to capitalise on what they had to offer over the years. When I talk about cultural activism, how am I going? 2 minutes. What's important is for me is that people participate in the projects. These are not films made by a filmmaker. They don't have that intervention of an artist or a director or a filmmaker in them. The projects often start with one person coming up to me and saying, how do I, could we, or could you show me how to? And that usually kicks them off. By the time we finish these projects, there may have been hundreds of people involved in some hands-on way in the processes. So my work is to devolve industry best practice from filmmaking, from media, from the arts, down to grassroots level, and to build skills within our community so that people can share their stories with the world. Mainstream media, for all the fact that what do they call it now? Information entertainment or something, infotainment. It's a $2.2 trillion industry globally. Now to put that into some kind of perspective, that's more than the world's GDP in 1970. And that's just one aspect of the industry. Still, grassroots level stories don't get told. We do see them more and more now emerging on NITV. But the media's not really interested in a kid planting a tree unless there's perhaps a politician standing next to them as a news story. I walk this sort of fine line between those different forms, between documentary, between observational filmmaking. I'm very much influenced by people like David McDougall, the ethnographic filmmaker. Just to throw a few names at you, Louis Malle, whose films on India in the early 70s, where he went to India and just shot footage and then kind of worked out what film he was going to make after the fact. And the later films of Werner Herzog. It's from them that I draw my stylistic and my method from those people. I'm interested in slow-moving stories about people, about community. When it comes to editing them, I've got to make sure that I've got everybody's face in the film. So that guides me. If I've got 300 people engaged on a project, little Johnny needs to be seen putting that tree in the ground or participating some way. So I'm not guided by the conventions of filmmaking, of those kinds of, or documentary or current affairs or news. The processes of those elements of the industry are in fact inhibiting factors. They slow us down. They stop people from telling their own stories. So often we're out there just what they call these days running and gunning, which is out of the car, the camera on your shoulder, go. Something natural light. Occasionally you'll get a kind of setup, you'll get a microphone onto somebody, but you're going out with these projects and shooting 40, 50, 60 hours of footage. Sometimes the projects last a year, and from that kind of mass, you've actually got to kind of draw a story out, which is kind of like how we worked on my grandmother's country, which was to go out with, first of all, with Lorina and a crew, and I have to just kind of put a hand up to mentoring, because I also mentor people. So not only was I mentoring Lorina, I was mentoring an emerging producer, an emerging camera person, a sound person, 2 stills photographers. So not only are we busy herding family and community across the kind of region from Bourke to Tibooburra, but we're also engaged in a kind of learning and sharing of knowledge process. Anyway, and I'll do this ask about face. I should have acknowledged first of all the traditional owners, the elders, especially those here who've endorsed my work for the 20 odd years that I've been here. And I also just want to close by quite rightly acknowledging the sovereignty of the Aboriginal people. So thank you.
We've got time for maybe 2 or 3 questions, if that's okay with you. Are there any questions for Laszlo?
Yeah, what did you think of that doco on Struggle Street?
I was angry. I was angry as I was watching. I was furious. Yeah. But I also had to acknowledge that it was true. Yeah, I had to say I lived in those kinds of streets. I was angry because the first time a major series addresses that issue, it goes that way rather than looking at Mount Druitt and the western suburbs in a much broader context than that. Here, I found it to be smug, and I am class conscious. I found it to be a very white bread middle class view of where I came from, and it infuriated me. At the same time, I have to acknowledge that yes, there was a lot of truth in it. Yeah.
How much influence do you think your early childhood and teen years has upon your current work?
Huge. I've worked with the poor, the dispossessed, the disadvantaged, the marginalised almost for my entire working life. I mentioned the Catholic Church early on. My sense of community was generated. Mount Druitt was a funny place. They had the Catholic Church had this bunch of German nuns and priests who had all worked out in the Kimberley for years from the 50s and the 60s, the Schoenstadters. And they got sent to Mount Druitt on a mission. Yeah? So they set up this kind of, this mission there. And it was run by a priest by the name of Carl Bowes, who'd been a U-boat commander during the Second World War. So he was a pretty gruff kind of character, but very much a humanist, very much, you may know about liberation theology from Latin America, Pope Francis, the guy who sits on the throne these days, very akin to that. So they were very progressive people, but they had this kind of, not quite like the Scouts, but had this very highly organised and structured hierarchy of men's groups, women's groups, boys' groups. And from the age of 12, I was responsible for a group of boys, 10, 9, 10, the few years younger than me. And what that gave me was a strong sense of community. We would go on camp every summer. The older kids would go on safari camp. We'd trek around New South Wales. We had this kind of sense of responsibility generated in us to each other, very kind of communalist. And I think my work is very profoundly underpinned by that sense of service to the community. When I made the break from show business, the first thing I became obsessed with was how can I serve? How can I actually walk out the door and say, are these skills useful to you? And how many of us can get involved in this process? But yeah, a profound influence. The kids I mentor, I don't want them living in the same kind of isolation, the arid, cultureless kind of environment and world that I grew up in. Yeah.
We might return to Rob, to Laszlo later, but we'll move on to our second speaker now, please.